I had us move to the inside and escape without disrupting.
Stick your shoes to the ground here.
Oh, yeah.
Switch my phone.
Phones off. One. Quite impressive.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon and good evening if you're following us remotely. Welcome to this press conference of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to present the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. Let me introduce your panelists today, going from my left, right to you. So on my left, Valérie Masson-Delmotte, co-chair of Working Group 1, and Pan-Mal Jai, co-chair of Working Group 1. Working Group 1 deals with the physical science basis of climate change. Then on their left, Abdallah Moqsit, secretary of the IPCC, and Hui-Sung Lee, the chair of the IPCC. Then carrying on, Jim Ski and Priyadarshi Shukla, both co-chairs of Working Group 3, which deals with the mitigation of climate change, and then Hans Otto Pertner and Deborah Roberts, co-chairs of Working Group 2, dealing with the impacts and adaptation. Deborah is sitting at the end because she has to leave to catch a plane in about half an hour. If you're following this press conference remotely, you can also ask questions by going onto Slido, that's sli.do, putting in the event code SR15 and then hitting join. And you can submit questions remotely, up to 300 characters, and you must put your name and organization in, otherwise we can't take them. If you're following this in the room or outside and you're covering it on social media, please use the hashtag SR15. So I'm going to hand over now to the chair of the IPCC, Dr. Lee, who will give you an introduction to the report, and then the co-chairs will give you some information about the report and go through the highlights, and then we'll be very happy to take your questions. We've got about an hour and a half this morning. Thank you. So I'll hand over to the chair, Dr. Hui-Sung Lee.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning. I'm delighted to open this presentation to you of the IPCC's new special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. This is one of the most important reports ever produced by the IPCC, and certainly the most keenly awaited. When governments meeting in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, known as UNFCCC, adopted the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015, they invited the IPCC to prepare a report in 2018 on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and related emissions pathways. Why did they do that? The Paris Agreement sets a target of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit it to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. At that time, thanks to the IPCC's, our last assessment, which is the fifth assessment report, governments had a clear understanding of the implications of warming 2 degrees Celsius. But relatively little was known about 1.5 degrees and the IPCC report, and the scientific research it catalyzed was intended to fill that gap. Why 2018? Because at the Katowice Climate Change Convention in December this year, governments will review progress on the Paris Agreement in a process known as a Talanoa dialogue. It was extremely challenging to produce a cross-disciplinary report on this subject in a relatively short time. This is the first time in IPCC's history all three working groups put their efforts together to produce this report. IPCC accepted the challenge, framing the report in the context of sustainable development and eradicating poverty. We have now delivered after a Herculean effort by our authors and experts and our Bureau members. The culmination of this process was last week's approval session here in Incheon with representatives of our member governments, working with authors on the summary for policymakers to ensure it was a clear, faithful representation of the full report. It was an intense and passionate 6 days with many sleepless nights, but always collegial and always respectful. Governments teased out the essentials of the report in a spirit of compromise, drawing on the creativity of the authors. The result was a summary and a report approved and accepted by all our member governments. This report is a rich resource for governments formulating climate policy areas that are affected by climate change, and a key input into coming climate negotiations. My colleagues will share the key findings with you in a very short minute of time. Let me give you the highlights. First, climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems, and livelihoods all around the world. Second, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is not impossible, but will require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society. Third, there are clear benefits to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees or higher. Every bit of warming matters. Lastly, the limiting warming to 1.5 degrees can go hand in hand with achieving other world goals, such as achieving sustainable development and eradicating poverty. With that, I would like to hand over to Valerie, the Working Group Co-Chair 1.
Thank you, Ho-Sung. Before we get on to presenting the findings of the special report on 1.5 degree global warming, I'm proud to unveil the draft cover page of this special report. An artist created the piece of visual art on this front cover, having been inspired by a scientific figure in the summary for policymakers. Perhaps you can recognize it. This is a very special report. It has attracted great interest from all around the world, which we can see reflected in some of the following key statistics. Our report is the outcome of the work of 91 dedicated lead authors and review editors from 40 countries, and the inputs of 133 contributing authors. And as part of the synthesis of new knowledge, the authors assessed more than 6,000 scientific publications. The successive drafts of the report received more than 42,000 comments from more than 1,000 experts and government reviewers worldwide. With that, I will now hand over to my fellow co-chair, Padma Ojai, to introduce the key findings of the report.
Thanks, Valerie. Today, we are presenting a summary of key findings from the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. You can find more detail in the summary of the policymakers and even more information in the underlying report. We begin with first section of SPM, understanding global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, we know that since pre-industrial times, human activity has caused approximately 1 degree Celsius of global warming, with likely range between 0.1 degrees C and 1.2 degrees C. We are already seeing the consequence of 1 degrees C of global warming through more extreme weather, rising sea levels, and diminishing Arctic sea ice, among other changes. If the world continues to warm at the current rate, global temperature is likely to reach 1.5 degrees C between 2030 to 2052. Although past emission from the pre-industrial times to the present will continue to cause long-term changes in the climate system, this emission alone do not commit to the world of 1.5 degrees C. Thank you.
Moving on to the second section of the SPM, which deals with projected climate change, potential impacts, and associated risks. Models project robust differences in climate between present day and global warming of 1.5 degrees and between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. Every bit of extra warming makes a difference. These differences include increases in mean temperature on land and in the oceans, hot extremes where people live, heavy rainfall in several regions, and the probability of drought in some regions. By 2100, global mean sea level rise would be around 10 centimeters lower with global warming of 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. This would mean up to 10 million fewer people exposed to the risk of rising seas. Loss of biodiversity and species extinction are projected to be lower with global warming of 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degrees would also mean smaller reductions in the yields of maize, rice, wheat, and potentially other cereal crops, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central and South America. The proportion of the world population exposed to climate change-induced water shortages would be up to 50% less with global warming of 1.5 compared to 2 degrees. Importantly, this special report highlights how all of these things affect people's lives and livelihoods around the world. For example, the impacts of climate change in the oceans are increasing risks to fisheries and livelihoods that depend on them. Limiting global warming to 1.5 compared to 2 degrees would reduce the number of people exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred millions by 2050.
And now the third section of the SPM, which deals with emissions and system transitions consistent with 1.5 C of global warming. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees implies reducing emissions of carbon dioxide by about 45% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. For comparison, in most pathways that limit global warming to below 2 degrees C, carbon dioxide emissions decline by about 20% by 2030. To limit global warming to 1.5 C, global emissions of carbon dioxide would need to reach net zero around 2050. This means that any remaining emissions would need to be balanced by removing carbon dioxide from the air. For comparison, pathways that limit global warming to 2 degrees C reach net zero around 2075. As part of limiting warming to 1.5 C, reducing emissions of substances other than carbon dioxide that affect the climate would improve air quality and have direct and immediate health benefits.
Okay, thank you, Shukla. I will continue on the topic of system transitions. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C implies changes on an unprecedented scale. It means deep emission reductions in all sectors, the use of a wide range of technologies, behaviour changes, and a significant increase of investment in low-carbon options. Rapid progress is already being made in some areas, notably renewable energy, but this progress needs to be picked up in other areas such as transport or land management. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, we would need to start taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere during the 21st century. The methods for doing this include planting trees, bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, changed land management, as well as some novel approaches that are very early stages of development. However, carbon dioxide removal on a large scale could have implications for food security, for ecosystems, and for biodiversity. The pledges that governments have made over the last 3 years are not enough to keep warming below 1.5 degrees C, even with ambitious and very challenging efforts after 2030. Carbon dioxide emissions would need to decline substantially before 2030 to avoid warming of more than 1.5 degrees C in the middle of the 21st century, followed by large-scale carbon dioxide removal. And at this point, I'll pass over to my Working Group 2 colleague, Deborah Roberts.
Thanks so much, Jim. And that brings us to the final section of the summary for policymakers, which marks a new and important innovation for the assessment, situating it within the context of strengthening the global response to climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. Climate change impacts and how we choose to respond to them are closely linked to the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainable development. These goals have been put in place as a global architecture to balance social well-being, economic prosperity, and environmental protection. As part of the response to achieving global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the mix of measures we might choose to enact to adapt to climate change or options to reduce emissions will, if carefully selected, have benefits for meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. This will obviously be most effective when the actions of governments are coordinated and when local and regional governments and decision makers are supported by national governments. It's also important that the strengthening the capacities of national and subnational authorities and other stakeholders, including civil society, the private sector, indigenous peoples, and local communities, can support the ambitious actions that would be required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. International cooperation, as we've seen this week, is a critical element for this to be achieved in all countries, for all peoples, especially for the developing countries and vulnerable regions of the world. This completes our presentation of the key findings of the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius. And just as Pan Mao stressed in the beginning, these are merely the key findings taken from our summary for policymakers. You can find all of the details in the full document and the underlying report. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Jonathan to start the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So we'll move on to the Q&A now. And a reminder, if you're following this remotely, you can send in questions on Slido, that's sli.do, with the event code SR15. You must give us your name and organisation there, otherwise we can't take those questions. And as Deborah just said, you can find all these materials on the website ipcc.ch, so the summary for policymakers, the press release, and also now the full report in the draft version sent out to governments in June, which is still subject to copy editing and corrections and layout. So, any questions in the room? I see David Shookman from the BBC, please.
Thanks very much. David Shookman, BBC News. Every IPCC report I've covered suggests that greenhouse gases need to be reduced, and usually urgently. What's different about this report? What's new?
Thank you, David. I'll ask Valerie to take that question.
The report is new in providing clear knowledge about differences in risks and impacts for half-degree warming, with robust findings that were not available at the time of the last IPCC reports, the SR15, for different regions, for extremes, for ecosystems, livelihoods. It's very clear that half a degree matters.
Thank you, Valerie. Question there, please. Please say who you are and where you're from.
Mr. Goddard, German Press Agency. It's a question to all of the panel. You said 1.5 degree goal is feasible. Is you're optimistic to achieve that goal? It's possible. How optimistic are you on a scale, let's say, from 1 to 10? And can you say why are you so optimistic to achieve it?
So a question on feasibility. Maybe Jim would like to take that one.
Yeah, one thing that the report did not aspire to do was to answer the question of feasibility in a yes or no way. How we approached it, rather than the number 1 to 10, we took 6 things. We identified 6 different conditions that would need to be met before 1.5 degrees was achievable. And we started with the very obvious ones. Is it possible within the laws of physics and chemistry to keep within 1.5 degrees warming? And we answered that question positively. We said it was possible within the laws of physics and chemistry. And we also looked at other conditions like do we have the technology and the kind of lifestyle changes available? What are the investment needs? Are they credible? But the last 2 points in terms of our conditions refer to things that actually scientists can't really answer, because it's about the political feasibility and the institutional side of it. This report was specifically requested by the governments who make up the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's, as was said earlier, it's the only named input into the Talanoa dialogue, which will be followed up in Poland in December. And frankly, we've delivered a message to the governments. We've given them the evidence, and it's really up to the governments to decide that last step of feasibility and what can be done. It's their job. We've done our job. We've now passed the message on, and it's their responsibility, having invited us to produce this report, to decide whether they can act on it.
Thank you, Jim. I have quite a few questions from outside the room now, so I'm going to start with Seth Borenstein of the Associated Press. Given that only 2% of the pathways limited warming to 1.5 without overshoot, and the report says point blank there is no definitive way to limit to 1.5 warming, how optimistic are you that the world will not exceed 1.5 degrees, especially with the US pull out of Paris? I think that might be for Jim again, actually.
Well, just to say, what the report does rely on is the literature that's out there. IPCC does not do its own research. It reviews the literature. And we have not found literature out there that looks at the specific implications of the US position on the probability or the feasibility of 1.5 degrees C warming. What we have done is said what the countries of the world collectively need to do. And, we don't go, specifically, we never go into looking at individual countries when we produce our reports. So we have sent a clear signal to the collectivity of countries. The US is part of the collectivity, though it said it intends to withdraw from Paris as soon as possible. So again, the messages are there clearly. Should it be the case that the US withdrawal makes any difference to its future emissions, it leaves it as an open question whether other countries step in to fill the gap. But again, that's not something for the scientists to decide. That's for the countries of the world.
Valerie?
The report is quite clear that reducing greenhouse gas emissions early on is needed to avoid overshoot, which means temporary surpassing global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we overshoot 1.5 degree global warming, then we would rely on carbon dioxide removal to go back to this level. Early action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is possible. There are options available. There are signs that mitigation is going on. But if this is to be achieved, there's an urgent need to accelerate.
Thank you. I have a question from Fiona Davis of Farmers for Climate Action in Australia. Climate action is already damaging agriculture around the world. What message does the panel have for policymakers who are focused on adaptation? I think maybe Hans and then Shukla. And then Deborah.
Well, the point here certainly is to make is that climate inaction will have an impact, a negative impact on agriculture, on crop yields, and so forth. But any approach involving mitigation approaches certainly has considered side effects and will have to be managed carefully. And under these trade-offs, the benefits would be larger than any negative impact of mitigation action.
In the context of the agriculture and the effect on that, the framing of this report essentially has the choice of pathways and which may come out from not only technologically feasible, but also that these are meeting the ambitions which are shown also for the sustainable development and the poverty eradication. And I think that issue is very much close to the agriculture development. And so in a way, the report has many messages which comes out for the sustainable development and poverty eradication and the nexus with the 1.5 degree climate change.
Thank you. And any more questions in the room at the moment? David Shukman again, please.
It's a question again about feasibility. When you look at the number of countries that are extremely reliant on coal, for example, or other fossil fuels, or the extent to which modern economies rest on fossil fuels, genuinely, hand on heart, how feasible is this plan of yours?
Well, this is not a plan, David. We are setting out the evidence and the options that policymakers face. And it's very clear that in the scenarios or pathways that we have assessed in this report, that coal use goes down very, very substantially by the middle of the 21st century. And this is an essential component of any of the transitions that you would need to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees with either no or limited overshoot. So again, that's a clear message to the countries. I mean, we can't decide on countries' energy policies. We have 195 sovereign countries who make up the Paris Agreement and are members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we can tell them, as we were invited, what would need to happen to put you on that pathway. But the question as to whether this will happen, I have to repeat the answer to the previous question. This is over to the governments when they meet in Poland later in the year and work on the evidence that we have provided them with.
Thank you, Jim. I have a question from the Laurie Goering of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. If international cooperation is crucial to achieving 1.5 degrees, and we see huge challenges to international cooperation today, how confident are you this report's messages will be turned into effective policy? I think, Jim, you might want to start off on that one, but maybe some others want to come in.
Thank you. I appear to be carrying a heavy load this morning. You know, again, you know, the conditions that we identified, you know, for the feasibility of 1.5 degree warming refers to the political, the institutional. It includes the concept of international cooperation. So again, the message is that countries will need to cooperate. We don't have a top-down agreement with Paris, it's bottom-up, but they need to take collaborative and coordinated action if we're actually going to achieve a goal of 1.5 degrees warming. So I think that's kind of all I can say. The message is over to governments at this stage. We've told you the scientific facts, the evidence, the costs. It is up to the governments now to decide what to do with it.
Thank you, Jim. Oh, Hans wants to come in on that.
Yeah, maybe just to add the specifics to this. The rule book for implementing the Paris Agreement is currently being compiled under the UNFCCC negotiations, and this report comes just in time to inform the next conference of the parties in Poland, and it will provide all the evidence that governments need to finalize the rule book and follow their own decisions that they would like to keep the world significantly below 2 degrees, if not 1.5 degrees. And they have, the first time in the history of the IPCC, they can draw connections between following these decisions and what it means with respect to avoiding impacts, as well as what it means for people, for sustainable development, for reducing poverty, and the benefits of meeting the targets, the sustainable development goals of the United Nations.
Thank you, Hans. I have a question from Chelsea Harvey of E&E News. Can you comment on the extended carbon budget in this report compared to the budget in AR5? That's the fifth assessment report. What contributed to that decision, and to what extent is the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees still debated among scientists or subject to uncertainty? I'll ask Valerie to take that one.
Thank you. So the report is providing an update of the estimated remaining carbon budget compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It relies on advanced methodologies to account for the current level of warming, as well as to account for the effect of non-CO2 factors, which also affects the level of global warming as well as air quality. So the report is very clear on the current understanding of the remaining carbon budgets, the sources of uncertainties, including possible outgassing of greenhouse gases due to permafrost thawing during the course of the century. And the next IPCC main assessment report will revisit new knowledge in the coming years, based on updated methods again. And that's how science advances.
Thank you. I have a question from Ethan, who describes himself as Urbana, Illinois, but I'm going to take the question anyway, because it's an interesting one. What consumer aspects does the report tackle? What lifestyle changes do people have to make to reduce their footprint on the climate? And I think that's for Valerie too.
It's an important question. We've talked about governments, but the report is also quite clear that everyone has means to act related to daily choices. The report clearly shows that behavior and lifestyles are important elements of the feasibility of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's also very clear that in pathways that optimize the benefits for sustainability, for instance, they are the pathways with low energy demand. There are also elements related to diets and the lowest imprint in greenhouse gases associated with diets, which are important elements of feasibility.
Thank you, Valerie. From Audrey Tan of the Straits Times in Singapore. Existing literature, Stern 2007, has shown that deforestation was responsible for more than 18% of global emissions. Have recent findings shown which would be more significant in reducing emissions, preventing deforestation or moving away from fossil fuels? Would Shukla want to take that one?
although I'm not really an expert on the forestry, but when I say that the forestry is very central to the report in terms of the ambitions which are shown by the governments, not only on the mitigation side of the ambition, but also the ambitions on the sustainable development, which are very closely connected with the forestation. Well, we find that the findings that we have in the report very much shows that well the decreasing trend of deforestation is sustainable, is feasible, such, and also combined with the mitigation options, the array of that, maybe this is one of the major findings with of this report.
Thank you, Valerie.
Yes, we've talked previously also about carbon dioxide removal, and the report has an important finding that measures such as the restoration of natural ecosystems and soil carbon sequestration can provide benefits for improved biodiversity, soil quality, as well as local food security. So these are important findings of the report related to land use.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row, could you say who you are, please, when you get the microphone? Microphone, please.
Thank you. Marlo Hood with Agence France Presse. Valerie, you mentioned that the report quantifies a possible impact of permafrost melting on the carbon budget. Is that the first time that no? All right, I'll let you correct me. Let me ask my question anyhow. Is that the first time that Earth system feedback has been quantified in an IPCC report, and how difficult is it in general to quantify those feedbacks within climate models? And will you be able to do more of that in the future?
So the report provides an estimated amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with permafrost thawing that is associated with elements of uncertainty related to remaining carbon budgets. But I would like to be very clear that the key message of the report is that if you would like to stabilize global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the key message is that net CO2 emissions at the global scale must reach 0 by 2050, and that's the most important part of the most important finding of the report.
Any other questions in the room at the moment? Okay, so from David Burrows of Freedom from Poverty in Australia, how long do we have left to act before it will be impossible to keep it to 1.5 degrees?
I can try.
Yeah, Valerie will have a go at that, and then Jim.
The report shows that we are at the crossroads, and what is going to happen from now until 2030 is critical, especially for CO2 emissions.
Yeah, I mean, can I just echo what Valerie said? The report has sent a very clear message that if we don't act now and have substantial reductions in carbon dioxide emissions over the next decade, we are really making it very challenging to impossible to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. So this is a very clear message. I wonder if I may pick up on a response to one of the previous questions, the one that asked about the avoided deforestation or fossil fuels. Can I just make the comment that saying option X or option Y is not the way this report is framed. The word or does not work in relation to the ambition of 1.5 degrees warming. The only linking word you can use is and. There is a very clear message that in the pathways that we have assessed, that all options need to be exercised in order to achieve the kind of level of ambition of 1.5 degrees. We can make choices about how much of each option we use and trade off a bit between them. But the idea that you can leave anything out is not possible. So the key thing is option X and option Y and option Z. It is the only option we really have to achieve this kind of level of ambition.
Anything else in the room? So from Alexander Kirk of King's College London, you mentioned behaviour changes of populations must alter. Can you elaborate on this? I think, do you want to take that?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, I mean, behavioural change is a key part of the emission pathways and the system transitions that we have looked at. And frankly, the more we are prepared to make changes to behavioural patterns that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the less we would need to rely later in the 21st century on perhaps more difficult options that we don't yet fully understand, like some of the carbon dioxide removal options. I think it's worthwhile saying that in terms of behaviour change, this is something that also connects to the other sustainable development goals and the world goals that Deborah talked about earlier. We are currently working on an IPCC special report on climate change and land, which will include the idea of food systems as a whole, including the question of dietary changes on the demand side. And what is very clear there is that there are lots of reasons other than climate change for shifting diets. If we changed our diets to fulfill health recommendations, we would all live longer, we'd bounce around much more and have much nicer lives, and we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So let's look at the optimistic side of this. Climate change mitigation is not necessarily a burden in terms of climate change. It can bring other benefits as well. And I think we need to hold on to that factor.
Thank you. I have a question from Umer Irfan of Vox. Can you elaborate on the use of carbon dioxide removal as a tactic? How feasible is it to cap warming at 1.5 degrees without any carbon dioxide removal? So I think, again, Jim and others may want to come in.
Thank you once again, Jonathan. Yeah, we have not identified any pathways that get to 1.5 degrees C without some form of carbon dioxide removal. At some point, to stabilise global warming at any level, we need to take as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as we put in. Therefore, carbon dioxide removal is unavoidable. But there is more than one way of doing it. And some of the options relating to land management and forestry practices, they are well established. And what we would need are the incentives and the kind of structures to enable these options to be taken up. And as we've said in replies to previous questions, the more we are prepared to contemplate early action that includes behaviour change, the less we would need to rely on the more difficult options like carbon dioxide removal, like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There aren't many scenarios we have identified that don't use bioenergy with carbon capture and storage to some degree, but there are one or two. So it is not impossible to keep to 1.5 without bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, but it would need enormously ambitious progress in other areas.
Valerie?
Yes, just a point of clarification. There's a need in the pathways to offset residual emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, for instance, from transport and agriculture. And that's related with the need to deploy negative greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide removal. Just a point of clarification.
Thank you. Question from Joydeep Gupta of Third Pole and India Climate Dialogue. The summary for policymakers warns of the danger of shifting food cropland to biofuels. In a 1.5 degree world, how serious is this threat? Maybe Hans can start on that. And
It is not really necessary to fully shift to biofuels. There are other ways of providing energy, and for the transport sector, there are other aspects that have been looked at in the context of the report, like CO2 recycling, synthetic fuels, and so forth. Certainly, there will be competition for land if the biofuel sector is the one that policymakers are fully supporting, but they would have to consider the trade-offs involved.
Thank you, Hans. Valerie?
Yes, I think a value of the report is to provide an exhaustive assessment, not just of climate response options, but also the synergies and trade-offs that they provide with respect to the multiple dimensions of sustainability. And that's an example where you clearly see potential trade-offs. For other options, such as restoration of ecosystems, you don't have these trade-offs and you maximize synergies. And these are important elements to consider for policymaking.
Thank you. I have a question from Eric Holthaus of Grist, which might break our rule here and allow everyone to speak on this one who wants. What did it feel like personally as humans to assemble this report? It feels like a very critical moment in history. Did you feel the weight of that history during your work? Well, we'll start with Valerie.
I must say it's a tremendous collective endeavor. We prepared the report in a stringent timeline, and it was amazing to see the level of involvement of the authors, the research community, and the new publications that were published timely to feed the knowledge in the report, and the dedication of everyone. So for me, it's an extraordinary collective adventure.
Thank you. Are there any other humans on the panel who'd like to address that?
Well, I think I would say that we did feel the weight of working with this report, but it was not a burden at all. And so I think like the enthusiasm to get into the different corners of science which has not earlier been examined. Now, we have particularly gone increasingly towards the exhaustive space, which now is shrinking space somewhere. And that, I think the report shows that, well, there is that space, but the space is shrinking. And that we would we can still do it as a universal humanity. And so I think that was the kind of spirit and the kind of weight with us of the burden that otherwise looked like unsurmountable, but it was never a burden actually. That it was something which was a very, very, I would say, a very. It gives you a kind of an enchantment to be a part of a process of this kind.
Thank you, Hans. Yeah, and Hui Sung, then Hans.
Right. In addition to the tremendous work put by our scientists and bureau members, I must recognize that there are 5 countries which supported the process of production of this special report, hosting the scoping meeting as well as the 4 lead author meetings. And in addition to that, and there are 195 member governments who lively discussed and improved the summary for policymakers. And we are very grateful to those governments who supported the IPCC activity, in particular with regard to the special report.
Thank you, Hui Sung. Hans?
Yeah, certainly the preparation of this report, which involved a huge interdisciplinary effort from physics to the social scientists, was a benefit in itself, but it also comes with some wishful thinking, that the messages that this report conveys are being taken up by the public, by the policymakers, by governments, and that the urgency of the issue is being seen because climate change is shaping the future of our civilization. If action is not taken, it will take the planet into an unprecedented climate future if we compare it to what has happened during all of human evolutionary history. So the scale of the changes that we are experiencing in the climate system is unprecedented. The scale of the changes that humans would have to implement in order to keep climate change under control is unprecedented. So it's a challenge for human civilization, and this report is therefore a milestone in conveying that message to human society.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, the few minutes have given me a chance to recover my humanity, which was severely challenged after 11 straight days in this conference centre, some of them day and night. I mean, I think for me, it was very clear for the approval session and the intensity of some of the discussions just how important this report is and how seriously countries took it and how hard they worked with the scientists to produce something that we could all agree on. But I also wanted to echo something that Hans said. We have 3 working groups in IPCC on the physical science, on impacts and mitigation. The fact that this was produced through a joint session of the 3 working groups is a substantial achievement. It has created an unprecedented degree of interdisciplinarity into the IPCC process, which we intend to carry out through the 6th assessment cycle. And this is partly because we've had to work together. But the other reason it's worked is because we like working together. We like each other and we've made new friends. So there is an unprecedented set of conditions for IPCC to work in a more cohesive way, I think, as a result of this initiative.
Thank you. And I think Valerie wants to come back on that too.
You want to say something?
Say for my feeling, because this special report, for preparation, we only have very limited time and work all very hard. And after the final gavel down, and all the people cheered up and celebrate for this approval of the special report. And I really feel very excited. We feel all our effort deserves, and we really produce a very objective and balanced special report for global warming on 1.5 degrees C. Thank you.
Thank you. Abdallah?
Thank you, Jonathan. I am just a secretary here. We are just facilitator. All the work have been done by scientists and co-chair. But I want to highlight 3 demonstrations. The achievement of this report is, first, is here because it was a good collaboration between scientists. Second, it is also a good manifestation of the collaboration at international level. We spent 6 days, but at the end, everybody adopts this report. The third demonstration is related to efficiency of IPCC. We asked in 2015, we invited by UNFCCC to deliver products to be useful for next COP in Katowice. We delivered, and this is a kind of demonstration. I will conclude by also one key element for the success of this report is related the contribution for the host countries. And I want to address a special thank to Korea, Republic of Korea, who from the beginning, from the address for His Excellency, the President of Republic of Korea, and as well as all the facilities during this week demonstrated that achieving 1.5 degrees C is possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdallah. Valerie?
I will try to summarize this in a few words. Nothing is impossible when you build on collective human intelligence.
Thank you. Now I have another. Where's it gone? Yes, another question from Seth Borenstein of Associated Press. What's the message you have to small island nations and other vulnerable areas and the poor, given that they think 1.5 degrees is a matter of life and death for them, and the report does not give them many possibilities it can be done? So maybe Hans will start with that. And,
I would not agree on the last part of the statement in terms of what can be done or not. I think all the interventions that we've heard so far indicate it is possible. It depends on the political will to implement. It depends on political leadership to take this message on. And it's within the scope of what humans can achieve. Certainly we are already seeing impacts and we are seeing challenges, but the good news is that if we can keep climate change under control, there will be benefits that go across sectors, from ecosystems to humans, to human societies, and there will also be benefits to the small island states, and the changes may stay within the scope of their possibilities to adapt to these changes. Because certainly one message is clear: if humankind wants to keep climate change at 1.5 degrees, there needs to be a strong effort in mitigating climate change and avoiding dangerous impacts, more of those dangerous impacts of climate change. But we all need to adapt to a different climate future, and the stronger we are and the more successful we are with respect to keeping climate change at 1.5 degrees, the more this will be within the scope of our adaptive capacity.
Thank you, Hans-Valerie.
Yes, I will try to formulate this with my words. To avoid poverty traps, for many people and many regions, sustainable development goes hand in hand with climate action. Mitigation also, but adaptation as well. And there's a need, as expressed in the report, to strengthen adaptation capacities in many regions.
Thank you. Now I have two questions that cover similar ground. So firstly, from Kate Aronoff of The Intercept, can you elaborate on what the implications of this report are for continued fossil fuel usage? How soon would coal, oil and gas, respectively, need to be phased out of energy systems? And then from Jeremy Hawkins of Interagency Newswire, from a quick scan, the report seems to underline that very rapid reductions in carbon dioxide emissions are now needed. What do the rates of emission reduction in the report tell us about how quickly the world will need to stop burning coal for electricity? I think, Jim.
Yeah, the ball has passed me once again on this one. The report is quite clear. I mean, there's a figure in there below which there is a table showing the specific shares of different fossil fuels in energy systems by 2050 under 4 different pathways compatible with 1.5 degrees C warming. And the messages are, first of all, that coal will have to be reduced very, very substantially by the middle of the century. Coal has the highest carbon content of all the fossil fuels. At the other end of the spectrum, there is still space for natural gas within the mix, especially if it is, combined with carbon capture and storage, which would continue to allow it to be used and play a contribution to electricity supply systems. The role of oil is interesting because one of the other messages in the report is that as well as reducing the carbon intensity of electricity, it also makes sense to use electricity more extensively in final energy demand. So the electrification of energy demand becomes very important. And that's the factor that leads to reductions in oil demand in the scenarios, particularly as the transport sector begins to decarbonize through the greater use of electrification or other low carbon means of transport. So I think the messages are quite clear on the fossil fuels. We have 4 different illustrative ways in which governments could think about how to keep global warming within 1.5 degrees, and they all involve really quite significant changes in the pattern of fossil fuel use.
Thank you.
I can add maybe a little bit to this. The report clearly also shows that the options which Jim just mentioned are available. The question which is discussed by the report and said certain kind of ideas is in case of a transition from the fossil fuel or towards a kind of a more sustainable and low carbon resources, there could be a lot of room still left. There is no need to panic actually that the fossil fuels will have to be phased out and the standard assets can be generated. What report argues and also informs us is that what we need is the redirecting of the investments which are otherwise moving towards the fossil resources, and how this can be gradually shifted and then can get aligned with the various new options which are opening up, both on the demand side and the supply side. And so there is a space here to make the transition which would not be unsustainable in terms of losing jobs, etc., which is right on the top of the policymakers' mindset. But we'll have to creatively use this existing space before it closes.
Thank you. I have a rather cross-disciplinary question from David Fogarty of the Straits Times, which we'll start off with Jim, but maybe others want to come in on. Governments have been urged to take stronger action for years, yet climate policies collectively are far behind what's needed. What will be the one big thing that will drive stronger policy action? More extreme, deadly weather events, voter pressure, business investment decisions?
Well, I think the difference about this report is this wasn't something that the scientists came forward with and presented to governments without any prior initiation. The government specifically asked for this report, and that, I think, is what the big difference is. So we're seeing a signal of willingness to take action on the part of governments, and what we've done is to provide the evidence for it. And, this is more for my colleagues like Hans on the impact side, but, we are seeing the kinds of changes in weather patterns that IPCC has been predicting over several reports. So the predictions are coming true, and I think that could be an important factor.
Thank you, Hans.
Yeah, maybe I can add to this with two examples concerning my own country. I'm coming from Germany, and I see two successes that may shape policies in the near future and may even cause a change in tides, if you want to call it that way. One of them is that this report got approved, and certainly before we got it approved, there were some question marks about it. Governments are clearly now getting the motivation to stand by the Paris Agreement and its implementation. And the second, more symbolic move was that by the ruling of a court and by combined with a mass protest against the destruction of a very large and important ecosystem, in the area where the brown coal mining is currently still going on in Germany, this destruction of ecosystem has been stopped, and there have been 50 to 60,000 people on the roads in a demonstration supporting the prevention of this destruction. So there is a mentality in civil society wanting reasonable climate policies in place, and it's a combination of all of these that is important in the changes that are ahead of us, in supporting the decisions that need to be taken very shortly in order to support the transformation that we need to go through.
Thank you, Valerie.
Yes, we spoke about the energy system, we spoke about agricultural systems or forestry, but there are many multiple dimensions in the report. With respect to the question, I really think that the question asked to us by governments places a strong emphasis on the near term, and the report provides multiple elements about options to accelerate transitions in systems such as infrastructure, industry, urban systems. What are the enabling conditions for each option, and how to maximize benefits for well-being for all? And I think that's really new within IPCC reports, to provide such an exhaustive assessment available for policymakers with respect to near-term options.
Thank you.
Jonathan, may I?
Yes, please, yes.
The question of policy really boils down to the two factors. One is cost of the policy. The second is the societal acceptability of that policy. Now, in terms of cost, the renewables cost is showing a very rapidly declining over recent experiences. And such a technological improvement in new areas of low carbon technologies will continue to improve. And secondly, it depends also, the cost depends upon the expected quantity of emissions reductions required. If future energy demand can be provided with improved energy efficiency, then the required emissions reductions will be much less than everyone can expect in this room. Therefore, the cost evolution depends upon what will happen to the renewables cost, as well as what happens to the efficiency development for the energy demand sector. In terms of the societal acceptability, the government, depending upon its national circumstances, has every right and every power to pursue the equitable and acceptable for its own populations, so that the cost of policy could be minimized and acceptable to their own constituencies.
Thank you. We have just under half an hour to go. Plenty of questions from outside. Are there any questions in the room? Yeah, lady in the second row. Please identify yourself.
Hi. My name is Jane Chung from Reuters. I have a question about the oil. There's no mention of the oil in the summary, so I would like to know if it will be mentioned in the main report, or if so, I'd like to know why. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, if you look at one of the figures, which has a lot of tabular information underneath it, you will see information on oil in there. So it is covered, and if you do a deep dive into the report once that's out, these topics will be covered.
Thank you. I have another cross-disciplinary question from Kate Redman of Climate Sphere. What are the biggest benefits of meeting the 1.5 degree target? So we'll start with Valerie and let others join in.
There are multiple benefits with respect to limiting exposure of many people to increases in climate and weather extreme events, such as heat waves and heavy rainfall events, for instance. And Hans could complement this with the ecosystem perspective.
Yes, certainly. I mean, the benefits are clearly in the avoided impacts and in the sustainability of a climate future. So there is reduced damages to ecosystems. For example, the losses of the warm water coral reefs that are already suffering from climate change could be reduced, and at least some of these ecosystems could be maintained. There are benefits to human health, because changing the energy system means reducing pollution, and keeping climate change at balance means reducing the number of mortalities due to heat stress and due to the redistribution of disease vectors. There are benefits to the economy, because there are impacts of climate change on economic growth, especially in the tropics and subtropics. So all of these impacts can be reduced by maintaining the climate goals as formulated in the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. Valerie, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, the report also shows that by limiting the level of global warming and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, slowing the rate of sea level rise during this century facilitates adaptation to rising seas, for instance, for low-lying areas like here in Incheon. And it may avoid triggering the irreversible loss of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets and committing to multiple sea level rise in the following centuries.
Thank you. So a question again from Laurie Goering of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. How much more stark are the warnings about displacement from sea level rise, risks and water scarcity, food harvest losses, etc. in this report than in previous reports? So I think that's one for Hans.
Well, this becomes a very important message, because clearly this report has shown that 0.5 degrees make a difference. And it is clearly, as we have elaborated in the last set of replies, that the impacts of climate change can be reduced largely by keeping global warming to 1.5 compared to 2 degrees of global warming.
Yeah, I want to insist that there are really multiple findings from the report's assessments that stress how much risk can be avoided by limiting global warming at 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. And several levels of risk have been revised compared to the last IPCC assessment report based on new knowledge. And they have been revised upwards.
Thank you. I have a question from Alexander Kaufman of the Huffington Post. Is it fair to say it's unrealistic that a carbon pricing scheme alone could keep warming within 1.5 degrees? So I think Valerie and Jim on that. No? Jim.
Okay, the underlying report refers to a mixture of different policy instruments that could be used to help limit the emissions compatible with 1.5 degrees C warming. And certainly carbon pricing would be one among that portfolio of instruments that could be used. There are some areas where carbon pricing may not be the most appropriate approach. In fact, if other complementary approaches are kept, it may be that carbon prices can be kept lower overall. One thing to flag is if we are going to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, is that people do need incentivized and given the signals to be able to do it. And it's perhaps in that area that carbon pricing is going to be important. Renewable energy can actually be cheaper than fossil fuels in terms of generating electricity, but you can never be cheaper if you've added carbon capture and storage to a fossil fuel plant. It's always an add-on cost. And therefore, carbon pricing and the right economic signals would be actually an essential part of the mix if that's going to be an important part of the portfolio.
Thank you. From Thais Gadea Lara of Canal de la Ciudad in Argentina. How do you expect this report to really impact on political decision-making in the different governments? Maybe Jim wants to start off with that.
Well, when I get back to the UK, first thing I'm going to do on Wednesday morning is go into the UK Parliament to give a talk on the report aimed at parliamentarians who are going to consider this. I think we can only speak about our own countries. The UK government has said that it will invite its independent experts to provide advice on mid-century targets and net zero as soon as this report lands on the minister's desk. So I think you can actually see that progress will begin to take place. People are responding to this report. A number of countries around the world have already penciled net zero targets into their legislation. So I think we're beginning to see the signs of the progress that would really pick up on the report.
Yeah, Valerie, please.
Yeah, I'm in the same situation. I'm expected to report back to the French Senate on Wednesday morning on the key findings from the report. But I think it's not just about our governments. And I really would like to see the report shared very broadly with the civil society and with students in universities all around the world. I think the knowledge assessed in the report is giving keys on how to act to multiple people, not only governments, and I wish it's shared as broadly as possible. And we try to have an effort with clarity, both in the text and figures, so that it can be more easily understood by anyone.
Thank you. Shukla, please.
Well, I would add that as we also head towards home on the next Monday, we will have a workshop organized by the Ministry of Environment in India with some other NGOs. And what we are increasingly seeing is that with many other outreach events which are being set up in Asia, that there is a kind of not only expectations which were there from this report, but this report could be becoming an anchor for various other activities and various other elements of sustainable development, etc. And so this can be a kind of a platform on which a huge amount of discussions on the technological transitions, on the sustainable goals, etc., would be framed where the climate change provides a kind of long-term view to this entire transformation which could be happening.
Thank you. Pan Mao.
Yeah, I think almost the same for China, because to think even for this approval session, there were 15 delegates from China. I think they're all well informed about the outcome of the special report. And we also have several lead authors participated, involved in the drafting of this special report. Also can be a resource, to report back the outcome of the report. And for me, immediately after I leave here, I will another assignment go to Vietnam for outreach activity. Then after that, I will go back to China. I already received several invitations to give some presentation about the outcome.
Thank you, Abdallah.
Thank you. Besides speaking about countries, to reach policymakers, we need a very strong outreach program. And this is why at level of Secretariat, we established a strategy of communication related to 1.5 special report. And we divide it in 3 phases: before the approval, between the approval and COP24, and after the approval. And I'm pleased to inform you that already IPCC Secretariat established a caravan of communication around 1.5 special report. And our chair has a very intense, and also with the co-chair, a very intense program of communication. And any station in the world where we have this communication, we are, as Valerie said, we are addressing governments, policymakers, as well as academia, as well as civil society, as well as students, as well as even children in school. And not only this, for those regions where we have some minorities, we are also addressing those minorities, like rural women, like some indigenous population. This is the program, and I think with this, we are trying to simplify the outcome of special report to be understood by all the communication to take action.
Thank you, Abdallah. Still got quite a few questions here, though I must say that the IPCC doesn't comment on the policies of individual governments, so we can't really take questions that address that. So one from Sandra Guzman of GFLAC. Have you estimated the costs to avoid the increase in 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees, or are you planning to do so?
Yeah, I mean, the report does look at the incremental costs of 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 on the mitigation side. I think if I remember the number, it's about a 12% increase in sort of energy-related investments in a 1.5 scenario compared to a 2 degree one. What I think the point that strong point we would like to make, it's not so much the increase in investment as the shift in investments. The need for an increase in investments in low carbon propositions, whether it's on the energy supply side, on the energy demand side, which is offset by reductions in investments and more in fossil fuel infrastructure. Well, just to say this, because the literature which this report assesses was produced very quickly, I think we would have an aspiration as we go into the rest of the 6th assessment cycle to look into the economics in more detail. So that's just to remind you in a way that this is a report on 1.5 degrees C that was produced very quickly, and the research communities and the scientists responded in a splendid way in terms of getting new literature out which we could assess. But there is still a lot of work to be done. So when we move on to the full IPCC reports in the 6th assessment cycle, I think the questions of the economics and a number of other issues will be explored in more depth. And that will be in time. We have to remember that the next big IPCC reports will be produced just in time for the first global stock take under the Paris Agreement in 2023. So we're very conscious of the overall schedule and how IPCC's activities synchronise with the work under the Framework Convention.
Thank you. I have a question from Paul Gross of WDIV TF4 in Detroit, USA. You've only mentioned needing to reduce carbon dioxide. What about methane, which is also increasing and is a more potent heat-trapping gas than carbon dioxide, but also in much smaller quantities in the atmosphere? So again, Jim, I think.
Okay, yes, methane is covered. I mean, there's a lot of attention to greenhouse gases other than carbon dioxide in the report, and methane is one of the most important of these. So that is absolutely certainly covered. I mean, it's worthwhile saying that certainly outside the context of this report, that the oil and gas industry, for example, has now started to pay a lot more attention to methane emissions and what can be done in fossil fuel production systems to reduce the level of methane. But methane is also important in the agricultural sector as well, which is, I have to say, is not my area of direct expertise, but methane is part of it. But it's worthwhile saying that the fact that methane is removed from the atmosphere much more quickly than for carbon dioxide is important. If carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, it essentially stays there. Methane, it actually comes out rather more quickly, which changes the dynamics. And perhaps my colleague Valerie could do the physical science aspects of that.
Actually, I will just refer to the pathways that make it possible to limit global warming to 1.5, close to 1.5. They involve deep reductions in emissions of methane and black carbon, another warming agent, 35% or more of both by 2050 relative to 2010. And I want to stress again that acting on methane, black carbon, and other components that have a climate effect, as well as an effect on air quality, can provide immediate benefits for public health.
Thank you. Question again from Marlo Hood of AFP.
Thank you. Was the fossil fuel industry represented during this, last week? Were they in the room? And as to figure 3B, where you have the information about coal, oil, and gas, was there discussion or among parties as to whether or not to include those figures? Was there any resistance on that score?
Yeah, Valerie?
Yeah, 2 points. So we have two authors with a strong expertise linked to the fossil fuel industry in the preparation of the report. And the additional information in the table behind figure SPM3B has been added during the approval process to the request of delegates to have more transparency on the implications of the four illustrative pathways for different components of the energy transitions.
Was there any resistance to putting those in?
It was asked by delegates.
Could I just add that, of course, IPCC plenaries include observer organisations as well as country delegations, and IPCC, which I forget what the acronym stands for, the International Petroleum Industry Environmental something, is one of the observer organisations, and I do recall seeing a representative of this organisation at the meeting, so yes, they were in the room.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? So, from Dennis Moynihan of Democracy Now! Can you address the issue of poverty reduction and reducing inequality? How can this be reasonably pursued, given that wealth inequality is higher than ever in recent history and is growing? And maybe Shukla would like to start on that, and others like to.
Well, thanks for this question. Well, as Manu said, the report is looking at many interconnections which are there, where the poverty is a central thing. For example, connections with the sustainable development and the jobs. And so the discussions within the report have within the SPM, as one would see, that, and also underlying report that the poverty is kept as a kind of a transformation space within that which is being explored, and not something which handicaps the move towards a kind of sustainable and the low carbon future. So I would say that throughout the report and also the SPM, you would find that the sustainable development and the poverty eradication is flagged throughout, where how its nexus is there, very strong nexus with poverty and the climate change policies. And I think that is something which is relatively different as compared to what one was seeing in the previous reports.
Thank you. Valerie?
Now, just to stress the fact that the report highlights the importance of policies that shield the poor and vulnerable, especially to resolve potential trade-offs for a range of sustainable development goals. So that's a clear message from the report as well.
Thank you. Question from Brian Kahn of ERFA. Does solar radiation management play a role in any scenarios in the report? Why or why not? Valerie?
So solar radiation modification is not included in any of the pathways from the literature assessed in the report. It's a different type of response, and the report is putting an emphasis on strengthening the global response based on mitigation options available now.
Jim, do you want to add to that?
Well, I would just add that one of the points on solar radiation modification is that the literature is quite limited in its scope in terms of what is available for IPCC to assess. So stratospheric injection, I think, is the technique that has actually been covered to the greatest extent in the literature. But it's all theoretical concept things, because we don't really have literature that describes actual experiments in the atmosphere. And in fact, a lot of the literature on solar radiation modification addresses legal, ethical type issues, and that is why the report is constructed the way it is. We have to follow the literature. One further point on solar radiation modification I might make is, of course, it changes temperatures, but it doesn't change the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there are other impacts of carbon dioxide emissions, such as ocean acidification, that are not addressed by solar radiation modification. I don't know if my oceanic colleague Hans Portner would be able to add to that.
That is correctly flagged, and certainly the ocean acidification, the degree of ocean acidification coming with continued CO2 emissions has already reached a threshold where impacts can be observed among ocean organisms, and these impacts would certainly become more severe if solar radiation modification is implemented and then the use of fossil fuels continues without changes.
Yeah, Valerie again.
Yeah, I want to stress that the consideration of ethics is an important element within this special report, and it's clearly expressed in the framing chapter. It's also a key consideration for things like solar radiation modification, and it's addressed in a specific cross-chapter box in the underlying report.
Thank you. Question from Egbert Born of Climate Movement Netherlands. What can you say about the forecast growth of aviation and carbon emissions of international shipping? Is it possible to stay within 1.5 degrees if they're not included in the next nationally determined contributions? Jim?
Yeah, I mean, just to say the very obvious point that aviation and maritime emissions do not fall within the scope of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and there are other international mechanisms or institutions for dealing with that. So just to say that these other bodies have indeed begun to take on the question of climate change. Very obvious issues that with aviation, it is very difficult to look at alternative ways of actually keeping planes in the air. We do need fuels with very high energy density to do that. So there are bigger challenges there, and possibly one of the few options there is the use of biofuels to reduce emissions there. The range of options runs is actually much wider in the maritime sector. And one of the things that I'm actually doing in about a week's time when I go back to London is to address a session of the International Maritime Organization and report to them on the outcomes of this report. So there is a great deal of interest in it. And the final point I would make, of course, I want to mention the full sixth assessment report again. And in our transportation chapter, we have specifically identified the topics of aviation and shipping as topics that will be covered in that chapter in a very, very explicit way.
Thank you, Jim. We do have some questions about the positions of different delegations to the session, to the summary for policymakers, but we suggest you take those questions up with the delegations concerned. I have a question from Chris Schrader of Spectrum.de. Back to the carbon budgets. Aren't there serious disagreements between different disciplines about how to calculate them? And what do the two different measures in the summary for policymakers mean? So, Valerie and then Jim.
Actually, that was the beauty of this report, bringing together scientists from different communities, climate modeling, integrated assessment modeling, so that they would work together within the same chapter to provide an update on the remaining carbon budgets. And there were also discussions about things like the metrics to be used to refer to the state of global mean temperature. This is clearly expressed in the report. Either you measure it by using sea temperature over the oceans and surface air temperatures over land. You can also use surface air temperature everywhere. This is easy to implement in climate models, for instance. And thus the report provides clarity on the implications of using one metric or another one with respect to the remaining carbon budgets.
Thank you. We have we have a couple of minutes to go, and so the last question, at the risk of overrunning slightly, is from Mark Hertzgaard of The Nation in the United States. The 1.5 degree target carries an obvious social justice component in terms of impacts, but can you address the justice component of the associated mitigation efforts? Won't a successful 1.5 degree effort require significant financial and technology transfers from rich to poor countries? So I think many people want to come in on that. Start off with Hans and then Jim or Shukla.
I think what we can say in this context that the synergy effect of various mitigation options has been discussed in this report with respect to their implications for various sustainable development goals as set up by the United Nations. And in all of these cases, the benefits are in excess of the trade-offs. So if and the general answer is that, and that has already been given during previous interventions, is that when it is successful to keep climate warming at 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees, there will be a benefit for sustainable development goals. And there's a statement to be made that hundreds of millions of people will benefit in terms of the goal of poverty eradication. So these overall benefits need to be taken into account when also discussing the point of view of equity.
But to say briefly on the mitigation side, the report has many interfaces which are there between the type of energy and also the sustainable development. For instance, the energy access is one of the very important goal in the sustainable development goals framework, and also the access to the water, which is again connected with the energy and the sustainable development. So there are many places where there are very specific interconnections of the energy and sustainable development one can see throughout the report, and that is something which is explicitly also built into some of the scenarios which are underlying the report's findings. And so I would say that the sustainable development and energy on the mitigation side, not only the mitigation of the energy side, but also the agriculture where the methane would be coming in, etc., have been explicitly considered, including actually that looking at the nitrogen oxides with the fertilizer use when you start changing towards the BACs, etc. And so there is a big span of the literature which has been very exhaustively reviewed in this report.
Thank you, Valerie.
Yeah, I would just like to read the exact sentence from the report that I think is most relevant to the question. Public acceptability can enable or inhibit the implementation of policies and measures to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to adapt to the consequences. Public acceptability depends on the individual's evaluation of expected policy consequences, the perceived fairness of the distribution of these consequences, and perceived fairness of decision procedures. And I think that's a very important point of the report.
Jim?
Yeah, I mean, if I can just say that this question I think is a very good one, and it's much on my mind because I've perhaps foolishly accepted an invitation in the UK to chair a commission on just transition, which is about these very issues of the implications for economic activity and employment. The report does very specifically mention to the importance of economic diversification as a strategy for regions and countries that might be affected by the scale of the transition that we are actually looking at. And it's something that the report hasn't really had time to go into, perhaps because the literature isn't there. But there are it's not a question of jobs disappearing under a low-carbon transition. It's about new types of jobs appearing. And there are whole sets of issues about reskilling the employment, changing the supply side of the labour market. That are sets of issues that we really need to get into to ensure that this transition can take place in a fair an equitable kind of way. So again, I think this is something, 1.5 isn't the end of the story. As we go into the 6th assessment report, these challenging issues will get further attention.
Thank you, Jim. And that's all from us today, but we're going to be back soon. You'll be hearing from us during COP24 in December in Poland. And next year, you'll be hearing from us a lot, because we'll have 3 reports coming out. A refinement to our methodologies for national greenhouse gas inventories, and 2 more special reports, one on climate change, the ocean and the cryosphere, and one on climate change and land use. But for today, that's it on global warming of 1.5 degrees. For those of you here or remotely, we'll be continuing with interviews the rest of the day, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very well. Excellent. Well done.
I think it was a good job, and I think they gave us quite into social
You shared all the burden. Well done.
We are going to be becoming the national university scientists, aren't we? I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. I think if we continue to do many of these from many scientific politicians and stuff.
You could be the next environmental minister in India. Yeah.